Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Gyo Kim. It's been almost 10 years since North Korean leader Kim Jong-un came to power. The available data shows North Korea's economy has been battered by the pandemic, and Kim Jong-un himself has admitted to the severe economic conditions in the country. Today we'll discuss how long North Korea can keep going on like this. Joining me is William Brown, adjunct professor at the Georgetown University. Professor Brown spent 3 decades in the U.S. government, including the CIA and the Commerce Department, focusing on the North Korean and Chinese economies. Troy Stangarone is also with me. Mr. Stangarone is Senior Director and Fellow at the Korea Economic Institute. Prior to joining KEI, he worked on Capitol Hill, advising on issues relating to foreign affairs and trade. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great to be here.
Since he became the leader, Kim Jong-un has put much emphasis on the economy. Looking back at the last 10 years, has he accomplished anything in terms of his economic policy? Professor Brown.
You know, in listening and watching Kim Jong-un just in the last few weeks, in a lot of ways, I feel a little bit sorry for him. Because when he started, 10 years ago, he inherited a pretty bad situation with the economy. His father, in the 1990s and 10s, they had an incredible amount of inflation. The yuan was worthless, great depreciation of the yuan against the dollar, and just lots of trouble, not much investment. And he took over the reins of it. And but now you look at him now, and he seems to be very frustrated. I think the word frustrated is the right word. So what has happened? The one good thing he's done, I think, is to stabilize the money situation. He got rid of inflation. That's a hard thing to do. And he's kept the value of the yuan up pretty high, very high, against the dollar and the Chinese money. But that's all at risk of coming undone just in the last few weeks, where there's a lot of volatility in the prices and exchange rate. So I think he's very frustrated because the one good thing that he's done is now at risk of coming apart.
Mr. Stangarone, was there any economic achievement during the past 10 years?
If we look back to literally a couple months after Kim Jong-un came to power, he said that no North Korean should have to tighten his belt again. And the idea is that they wouldn't have to go hungry, that they would be able to take and enjoy what he referred to at the time as sort of the benefits of a socialist economy. But in reality, as long as he was going to continue to pursue nuclear weapons, which we've seen since 2016 has resulted in sanctions on essentially all major exports from North Korea, also sanctions on certain key imports into North Korea, it was going to be difficult to try and really one, grow the economy, 2, attract investment that you might need to take and transfer technology or other capital to take and really sort of start businesses going forward. And so I think until he resolves this tension between his nuclear objectives and economic objectives, it was always going to be too much to really hope that North Korea could get beyond perhaps a phase of, getting by.
From the beginning of this year, Kim Jong-un held a number of cabinet meetings to address the economy. And Kim Jong-un has called for another arduous march against economic difficulties. Professor Brown, how is the current situation comparable to the famine North Korea experienced in the 1990s?
Yeah, I'm always careful in talking about famine in North Korea, partly because I was in the government, in the Commerce Department at the time of the 1990s famine. And from my perspective, our government really didn't notice what was happening. Nobody noticed what was happening until it was too late. So I'm a little uncomfortable wondering if our government knows what's happening now. I kind of think not. So although I don't think there's anything like a famine, and there are good reasons to think those kind of problems have been alleviated by the markets. Markets prevent famine, and there are a lot of markets now. So I don't think it's anywhere close to that situation. But I am always cautious in thinking what we don't know and what our government should know and what other governments should know. They should be telling us if there is a real famine in the works.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Stangarone, your view?
So I agree with Bill. I think there's a lot that we don't know about what's taking place on the ground. What we do know, if we look and take at face value at least Chinese trade data, is that this year so far there have been no imports of cereals. Last year there was very little, as the North Koreans didn't completely close the border, but essentially closed it to most imports and exports. So when we look at the situation, I think what we can say is that the imports or the aid that they were receiving from abroad since the pandemic began has been significantly constrained. And when we look, I sort of looked at estimates of agricultural production in North Korea in terms of cereals, and then how much they would import. Depending on a given year, cereal imports probably accounted for maybe somewhere around 8% of their imports. Given the situation in North Korea, that's a more significant amount than it might seem in other countries. But I think what we can say is that they've probably lost most of that. And so the situation in terms of food is getting tighter. But I do agree with Bill that I think this is where markets help to take and allocate resources to try and deal with these types of issues.
Mm-hmm. Professor Brown, the border has been tightly closed for more than a year now. How are North Korean people sustaining themselves?
North Korea is, compared to most countries, is fairly self-reliant in terms of consumer products. They don't import a whole lot. As Troy says, they import, for a few percent of their food requirements every year, but not a lot. Nothing like Japan or South Korea, even China. So they can, the people can kind of eke it out. They can, and they're very, they're used to this. I don't think the situation is worse really than in the 90s or, but certainly some people are in very bad shape. Some people are probably starving. Some people probably are dying from malnutrition. And the hardest thing for us from the outside looking at North Korea is the poorest people, no doubt, are the farmers, the people in the hinterlands, and there are millions of them. And the people in the camps, the ordinary people. We see a fair amount of people in Pyongyang, and they seem to be well-dressed and have phones, and seem to be doing okay. But we don't really get a good insight, I don't think, into the normal people in North Korea, who I think are in very bad shape. So a little bit of a decline might put them over the edge to loss of subsistence. And that's the real danger here.
Right. Professor, we know that the trade volume between North Korea and China has plummeted during the past year. Is North Korea still dependent on China?
They're dependent on one important crucial product. Right now, their trade is almost zero. It's amazing because China is usually their biggest trading partner. By far, like 90% of their trade, it's all gone, except for crude oil. Back in Mao Zedong era, Kim Il-sung era, apparently Mao and Kim made an agreement that North Korea would get 500,000 tons of crude oil. That's about 3.5 million barrels of crude oil every year from Daqing, from their Chinese big oil field, Daqing, up in the northeast. And they've gotten that consistently. I think every month they get 50,000 tons for like 25, 30 years. That's North Korea's main, really right now, only source of crude oil and thus petroleum. They get refined products, gasoline, kerosene, diesel, in the ship-to-ship transfers, and some of it is allowed, a fair amount is allowed by the UN. But that's relatively small compared to the huge volume of crude oil. So that's right now North Korea's most biggest dependency. I've often criticized China for providing that crude oil free. I don't, they should sell it to the North Koreans like they would sell it anywhere else. China has to import crude oil, so why don't they pay for it? But I've come to think in the last year, 2 years, that maybe China is playing a smart game by giving North Korea that one lifeline. And I kind of suspect, I don't know this, but I suspect that Kim Jong-un knows if he does something bad, like another nuclear explosion or an ICBM launch, that China can cut that tether And then they would be in really deep kimchi.
Mr. Stangarone, is there any way for North Korea to make a breakthrough in order to change the current economic environment?
So I think when we look at the situation right now in the pandemic, there's a few things that need to happen. One, just like every other country, North Korea needs to gain access to vaccines to vaccinate enough of the population to reach herd immunity. The challenge that North Korea has in this endeavor is that, in essence, they do have a cold chain system. The UN built one in the early 2000s. It's very good for basically vaccines that can be kept at sort of cool temperatures or room temperature. But Pfizer, Moderna, these types of vaccines have to be kept too cold of a temperature to basically be utilized. But the bigger challenge, because COVAX, the UN effort to take and vaccinate poor and developing countries, was going to provide North Korea with vaccines. These, though, were going to be the AstraZeneca version, which would fit in their cold chain system. But because of the pandemic's outbreak in India, India has banned exports of the production of the AstraZeneca vaccine from there. So we've seen basically those shipments cut off. It's unclear when North Korea would get them. There's also issues dealing with whether North Korea would allow monitors for the vaccines, which COVAX is requiring. But I think step one is taking and getting access to the vaccines and getting the population vaccinated. The challenge is I could see that not being until 2023 or later, the way some of these issues are sort of rolling out right now. But even once you get past the pandemic, then really you have to address the issue of the nuclear program. Sanctions aren't going to be removed anytime soon. Russia and China seem to be willing to allow a certain degree of smuggling, but that's only going to take North Korea so far. So ultimately, I think really after you deal with the pandemic issue to sort of reopen the border and normalize things, you have to deal with the nuclear issue.
Professor Brown, most recently Kim Jong-un said a crucial case has happened that could threaten the safety of his people. Is this Kim asking for outside help?
I'm not really thinking he's asking for outside help. I'm thinking he's focused mostly domestically, almost like a laser, looking at his own situation. I think Kim is in a very difficult spot here. And I don't know, I don't think he's making up issues because I think the issues are very important for him. But it's just very convenient for him right now to keep the border closed, to keep all the outsiders from coming in and taking a better look. I don't know what his solution there is. If he's vaccinations would be helpful, surely, but if that's the real problem. But even with the vaccinations, you got to wonder, are they going to vaccinate the people that are most vulnerable? People in the camps, you can imagine, would be incredibly vulnerable, but they're not going to vaccinate those first, I don't think. So all kinds of issues come up with this outside influence.
Mr. Stangarone, there are views Kim Jong-un and the North Korean regime are not ready to respond to the U.S. call for talks because they're too caught up in dealing with what is happening domestically. Is the current situation really the reason behind North Korea not coming out to the talks, you think?
I think it's playing a very significant role. When we look at sort of the past history of negotiations, going into the agreed framework, North Korea had essentially created a crisis by threatening to and then filing paperwork to withdraw from the IAEA. If you look at the six-party talks, if I remember correctly, just after the first round of talks, they tested their first nuclear weapon. So in each of these two major negotiations previously we've had with North Korea, the North Koreans came into the talks with a fairly strong hand. Even with President Trump and the in-person diplomacy, we often like to focus on the issue of fire and fury and like to sort of tell ourselves that we drove Kim Jong-un to the talks. But if you look back, those efforts on the U.S. side didn't stop North Korea's testing. If he goes into negotiations now, everyone knows that the North Korean economy is in significant stress. We know that the pandemic is going on. From the North Korean perspective, you're essentially going into talks, in a very weak position. I would, hazard that if I were in his shoes, I would want to get through the pandemic before I look to return to talks. So I wouldn't, preclude them because situations could change. But I think that that's probably playing a very significant role in why we haven't seen North Korea be willing to respond to requests on the U.S. side for talks.
Professor Brown, doesn't the economic difficulty give all the more reason for North Korea to open itself to the outside world?
Well, not really. As Troy is suggesting, it's very hard to open up when you have internal problems, unless they're really desperate, like maybe they were in the Great Famine. But they're not that desperate at this point, obviously, or they would be asking for help. They're not asking for help. But more broadly, I think, as an economist, I always like an economy to try to correct its own internal problems before it opens up. This was the real genius of South Korea in the early 60s. They cleaned up a lot of their internal problems with their money system before they opened up. China did the same. I'm thinking North Korea needs to undertake some important internal reforms to make it ready to open up. If I were them, I would be deathly afraid of opening up in the face of massive China right next door, big, powerful Samsung Industries in South Korea, Japan, the U.S. I mean, they must feel very vulnerable to those kind of companies and countries. But there's things they can do internally to make themselves ready for that and prosper from it. But Kim started to do that. He just hasn't finished it. And that's, to me, the problem. He needs to push through and finish some of his reforms.
Professor, how long can North Korea continue on like this? I mean, as you said, will Kim Jong-un be able to finish what he has started?
Yeah, I think North Korea is changing quite a lot. So it's a little bit unfair to say, they just muddle through or just keep going on and on. Things change naturally. And North Korea is a very different economy now than it was 10 or 20 or certainly 30 years ago. The big change is the use of money. Everybody uses money. And that's like moving toward a market economy. It's just not finished yet. There's some good indications just in the last week. One where a group of farmers up in the Northeast, apparently, the price of rice soared. And apparently a bunch of farmers had stored away their rice and now they're selling it into the market. Well, that's exactly the right kind of market response that you like to see. And in another case, apparently the government now, the socialist government, is ready to sell rice at just below market rate from military reserves. Wow, that's a tremendous market activity. That's what any other government would and should do if they're short of rice. They should sell their reserves. Not give it away at ration prices, but sell it because the government needs money. So to me, this system is changing pretty quickly here and in the right direction. But again, I say there's some things steps they need to take to reinforce the government's ability to buy rice and resell it. Those are the kind of problems, internal problems, budget problems that all countries face. And I'm hoping that Kim Jong-un will see that he has to operate the country a little bit more like a normal country rather than a state-owned monopoly.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Stangarone, do you see any possibility of North Korea's economic system changing?
So I don't think it'll change drastically. I think we're going to see continuing slow evolution. As Bill was saying, if you look back at where the economy is now as opposed to where it was when Kim Jong-un took power, there have been a series of changes, and I think the economy does look different than it did then. I think the difficulty is that you've also seen, and this predates back even slightly before the pandemic, efforts by the state to sort of reassert control. Prior to the pandemic, they had started taking and requiring state trading firms to get price approval for trades from the ministry itself rather than on their own negotiating contracts. And so if we keep seeing the state try to roll things back or to get more control, and we've seen more of this in the pandemic with the decisions on whether to open or close markets being sent down to local party officials and more constraints as well being put on the markets, then I think you're going to have challenges in really moving the economy forward.
Professor Brown, just follow up on that. if, I mean, you said North Korea is going through changes gradually, but if it's not fast enough, will it be able to really keep going on like this?
One problem Kim Jong-un introduced in 2018 with the summits, remember, he was very ebullient, very positive, raising expectations, talking about all these good things that were going to happen. And now 3 years later, he seems very frustrated, down, saying all these bad things are happening. So he's really discouraged the population, I think. He raised their expectations, and now he dashed the expectations, talking about hunger again. Well, that's got to be a huge political problem for him. I don't care all of his legacy, his Kim legacy, all the soldiers aren't getting paid or fed. I think he's risking maybe not a collapse of the country, but a collapse of his regime. That's why I think he's so frustrated and working hard. He's changing ministers around, he's moving people around. I think he's nervous, and rightfully so. Again, not for the country. I'm not predicting a collapse of North Korea. But I am thinking his regime, if I were him, I would be very worried about my own regime.
North Korean leader Kim Jong-un vowed to boost relations with China to a new strategic point in his message to Chinese President Xi Jinping on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party of China. North Korea and China continue to highlight their close and friendly relations amid stalled talks between Pyongyang and Washington, while the rivalry between the US and China escalates. Professor Brown and Mr. Stangarone, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.